What I propose to do today is to initiate a discussion on the links and intersections of the archival and the archaeological. In doing so, I will start by deploying the term archive, both in its conventional sense, as the repository of usually documents, but also in a more heuristic, a metaphorical sense, as the assembled body of materials consigned for collection and preserved for posterity. I'm not an archivist and nor an archival scientist, and I assume that the same goes for the majority of you. If this talk were to stay purely within the confines of archival science, it would have been relevant only to a small group of professionals, with topologists, Tomali and others. But I hope to show instead that the topic of my talk today is far more fertile and multifaceted to be left only to the professionals, to specialists. I put it to you, and I hope to show today, that for us, archaeologists, for ethnographers, and for those of us who are also claiming to be doing archaeological ethnography, archives, both as material and as conceptual entities, are good to think with, to paraphrase Lévi-Strauss. As we know, archives are not the most obvious field site for an archaeologist, save for the ones who research the history of the discipline, and perhaps those who are involved in diachronic regional projects. In some ways, archaeological research is often juxtaposed to the archival research in an antithetical, if not always binary manner. Archaeologists work with objects, whilst historians work with archival and other texts. In most cases, archives speak of authority and administration. They are usually seen as top-down, whereas archaeologists work from bottom-up. They deal with small things forgotten. But things are not that simple, as I hope to show. In a text that has become canonical, Archive Fever, Jacques Derrida invites us to reflect on the etymology of the term archive from the ancient Greek archeon. He draws our attention to the fact that archaea were the seats and the residencies of the archons, the superior magistrates, and the persons who are first of all the document's guardians, who do not only ensure the physical security of what is deposited, but are also accorded the hermeneutic right and competence. They have the right to interpret the archives. Archi signifies at the same time the origin, that which is at the beginning, as well as that which perhaps pertains to authority and power. And archeon perhaps fuses together both the meanings. Derrida goes on to say that archival practices are domiciliatory, more playfully that they perform a house arrest. And finally, that they rely on a privileged topology, or as I would prefer to rephrase it, they rely on a topology of privilege. The term archive, both in English and in Greek today, has of course lost that original meaning. But this thought experiment that Derrida asks us to perform has been very productive. It has forced us to reflect on the quest for origins, on the impulse to accumulate and preserve at special places originary materials, and on the authoritative connotations that this accumulation act produces, and on the power effects of this privilege to access, to bring to light, to decipher, and also interpret. As is evident from the rest of Derrida's essay, which goes on to link the notion of the archive with Freud, Sigmund Freud, and the Freudian use of archaeological metaphors in psychoanalysis, he, that is Derrida, does not see the archive as simply a physical entity where documents are kept, but as a concept central to the human condition. Moreover, he wants to talk as much about the act and the process of archiving as about the actual archive itself. And in that sense, his thought intersects with a new wave of historical anthropologists and others who started treating the actual archives in a different and rather more productive manner. Not simply as sources for the extraction of information, but as ethnographic sites, as artifacts with their own biography that needs to be understood. The anthropologist Anne Stoller, at the forefront of this movement, entitled her 2009 book, Along the Archival Grain. In a critical dialogue with Derrida, her point is that before we castigate archives as sites of authority that need to be exposed and deconstructed, or sites that with meticulous detective work may reveal the voices of the silenced, we'll need to understand their own logic. She does not oppose to the reading of the archive, especially the archives of colonialism, against the grain, but she calls for the additional reading along the archival grain, to explore, in other words, not only the conditions of their constitution and production, but also the anxieties, the fears, the tensions that they embody. In other words, these calls ask us to consider the archiving process alongside the physical and conceptual entity of the archive. And they also invite us to trace the affective and emotional economy that underscores a seemingly dry and deceptively distant administrative process and operation. Such a move had already been prefigured, again by Derrida, when he asked us to reflect on the act of consigning, on the process of deciding which items, documents, or objects are deemed worthy for house arrest, to use his phrase, for entering the archive, for gathering together, and for preserving for posterity. And to illustrate very briefly what I mean by this change of perspective, I'll refer to two examples from the archives of the American School of Classical Studies next door, which I came across while I was working on the history of the contract of the Agora excavations in Athens. And this is it's shot from the archives of the Greek Archaeological Service, a photograph of an photographer showing part of the area before the excavations, an Elia picture during the excavations, and the first document I want to briefly mention. Now, the first is a scrap piece of paper kept in the administrative records of the archives of the school. It is a handwritten note, scribbled down seemingly in a rushed manner, possibly unofficial minutes of an informal meeting. Now, the context here is the initial plans to institute the Agora project as a collaboration project, a kind of a synergasia project, between the American school and the Athens Archaeological Εταιρεία. The signatories, or should I say the names of the persons at the bottom, are the president and the secretary of the Εταιρεία, Papoulias and Economou, and the chairman and the director of the American school, Edward Capps and Liz Carpenter. As far as I can tell, the previous scholars who worked on the Agora project and its history did not consider this not worthy of discussion as a potential source of information, possibly because of the rushed and scrappy nature of the document. Yet, the materiality and the condition of this artifact is crucial in understanding the context and the nature of the negotiations amongst the key protagonists of this episode. The handwriting, the several languages in which the note was written, the scrap paper used, and the rushed style. I can also add that in the names at the bottom, three of them are mentioned as Mr. Papoulias, Mr. Economou, and Mr. Capps, whereas Liz Carpenter is with full name, first name, and surname, perhaps the only person who signed it. Details like that are extremely important. We know that the negotiations between the school and the Εταιρεία and the government were extremely tense. they involved mediators from many institutions in Athens and beyond. And they threatened that tension, that threatened to cause the collapse of the whole project. At the end, as we know, such a collaboration plan was abandoned. And this piece of paper embodies the precariousness of the idea of that collaboration in the first place, and the power inequities on which it was based, and which at the end caused its premature death. I came across the second document by accident while working on the same project. Again, a handwritten letter by Kourouniotis, Director General of the Greek Archaeological Service during the Agora negotiations, and the person who was instrumental in the successful completion of the deal between the American school and the Greek government. The handwritten letter was addressed to Bert Hill, a personal friend of Kourouniotis, ex-director of the American school, and the person who first approached the Greek government on behalf of the school asking to excavate at the Agora. But this letter is not about archaeological matters. It's about much more pressing. It was written during the terrible winter of 1941, the winter of the Great Famine in Athens, in which 300,000 Athenians died. And Kourouniotis asks his old friend to intervene so that he can secure some affordable basic foodstuff, bread and milk. Just leave you a couple of seconds to read this before I... The second page. It has been 8 days now, he says, that we have nothing but milk, for even the little bread that they used to give us does not exist anymore. Now, note that Kourouniotis in 1941 was 69 to 70, retired ex-director of the Greek Archaeological Service, the top archaeologist of the country. It is clear that, as with the majority of Athenians at the time, his bare survival was at stake. In one sense, this document, as a piece of information, adds very little to the history of archaeology in Greece. And at the general level, the story tells the story of hardship and deprivation is well known. But at another level, the document is not only an emotional and dramatic call for help, showing that even previously privileged Athenians felt the immense pressure. More importantly, it is a testament to the economy of affect that connected key protagonists of Greek archaeology, in this case Kourouniotis and Hill. An affective impact that cannot fail but reach the present-day researcher as well. If we are to reflect again on the nature of the relationship between the archival and the archaeological, we may realize that, in fact, the two processes are very similar. Archaeologists, in effect, also produce an archive. They accumulate, they generate objects, documents, and photographs. Two pictures from our Koutroulou project showing that process of generating documentary objects as well as archaeological physical objects, even ethnographic objects in this case, when our ethnographer here, Aris Anagostopoulos, is keeping his ethnographic notes next to the trench. And increasingly, of course, digital archives that contain all these archaeological products. The power to consign, designate an item as worthy of entering the archaeological archive is paramount, as is, to use the Derrida's term, the archontic power to access, to guard, and interpret the archival objects or perhaps subjects, keep them under house arrest. The fact that the domicile, in the case of archaeology, may be called at times a museum, and at other times the excavation or field archive, or that archaeologists prefer the term archaeological record than archive, are of secondary importance. As with the archive, the archaeological record is not given and handed down to us by past people, but produced through archaeological processes of consigning, designation, and selective recovery, preservation, and presentation. The allure of the original, the attraction of the rawness of the primary data, and the associated illusion of objectivity and concreteness lies at the basis of both the archival and the archaeological impulse. And of course, quests about origins and ancestors inherent in the notion of the archive are at the center of archaeology as well. If that is the case then, and if the archival and the archaeological impulse are much closer than we think, then it makes perfect sense for an archaeologist to engage with the archives in both their conceptual and their physical configuration. Not only because they constitute an important field site for the accumulation of past materiality, but also in exploring side by side these collateral devices, the archival and the archaeological, were in a better position to understand both, as well as the broader regimes of modernity that gave rise to them. The archival impulse is not confined to specialists, however, in the same way that the archaeological impulse, the desire to engage with past materiality in a tangible manner, is shared today by many people beyond the archaeologists and the heritage professionals. Penelope Papaelias' important work has shown that the archival desire in grace is shared by many people beyond academic and professional historians. At the same time, the popularity of magazines, movies, TV programs, computer games with an archaeological theme, both in Greece and more generally, reveal a desire to engage with the past and its materiality in a direct and intimate manner. The realization that these popular quests can no longer be ignored by scholars, and that they can provide more important insights than simply amusing anecdotes, has contributed to the emergence of new endeavors, such as archaeological ethnography. And this is the publication that Amalia mentioned, the results of a workshop that we held at Poros 3 years ago, on the whole new field of archaeological ethnography. But what do we mean by archaeological ethnography? Well, archaeological ethnography is not ethnoarchaeology. In other words, it does not study the present in order to explain the past. It does not use present-day people as some sort of proxies for the people of the past. A venture with obvious ethical as well as epistemological problems. It is not sociocultural anthropology either. In other words, an independent ethnographic study of the same context, the same local context, running alongside archaeology. Finally, it is not public outreach in the conventional sense of the term. In other words, it is not an attempt to educate local people on the value of archaeology and communicate with them the results of the archaeological fieldwork. An effort which, especially when undertaken in an unreflective manner, often acquires all the paternalistic features of the authoritarian scholarship, a phenomenon that local people know very well and they have learned to distrust. Archaeological ethnography, as we define it, is not a methodology, nor a subdiscipline, but a shared cross-disciplinary and transcultural space, a common ground, in other words, a meeting arena. First of all, it is a space where scholars of diverse disciplinary backgrounds and origins can meet and interact. Archaeologists, social anthropologists, scholars from other disciplines, historians, artists, and others. The quest of archaeological ethnography revolves around two key themes which are central to the archaeological, but also to other scholarly endeavors such as material culture studies and historical anthropology. These themes are materiality, that is the properties and the effects of the material, including sensorial effects and affordances, and its archaeological constitution. And the second is temporality, that is the social and political production of time, and the power of the material to embody and activate various times, often simultaneously. Around these two key themes and concepts, archaeological ethnography explores the diverse popular and public perceptions towards the material past and towards archaeologists in their archaeological work through long-term, intense, and systematic field engagement involving ethnographic and other procedures. I would argue that archaeological ethnography also offers the space and the opportunity to explore the archive and the archival process integrated within the overall archaeological enterprise. This can happen in diverse ways and at different levels. At one basic level, archaeological ethnography is multi-sided, and as such, it follows the argument and explores the tensions and the anxieties wherever these are located. As such, an inquiry that may start at the edge of a trench or the local coffee shop can lead to the local archives or to the archives of the respective FORE of antiquities. At another level, however, archaeological ethnography brings into sharp focus the different conceptions of the archival process, the different valorizations of the material to be archived. In other words, the often diverging or even contradictory conceptions of what is worthy of entering the archive, archaeological or other. And finally, archaeological ethnography itself produces its own material, documentary, artifactual, oral, artistic production in physical and digital form, which also demands to be archived. Allow me to illustrate these generic and theoretical points with some examples from our archaeological ethnography project as part of the Calabria research program at Prof, co-directed by the late Bert Wells and Arto Pentinen, now directed by Arto Pentinen, who is with us tonight. The site of the archaic and classical sanctuary of Poseidon, which was the focus of our research, was in the 19th and the 20th century also the home of an extended family who came to Poros and from the nearby island of Angistri to harvest the pines for resin, for pine resin. And here you see a pine tree from the site next to the actual sanctuary, next to the actual temple, the remnants of the temple, which has been harvested for the pine resin. You can clearly see the incision, the old incision, and the trace it has left on the tree. That family, built a farmstead amongst the ruins of the sanctuary, and they planted olives and other fruit trees. They cultivated cereals on an annual basis, and they reused some of the ancient structures as part of their buildings. They even reused two of the perivolous walls of the temple to construct a basin for the collection of resin. You can see here on the left here some of their own modern structures, cement floors and walls next to some statue bases and some of the remnants of the stoa and other buildings of the sanctuary. And the remnants of an oven they constructed, again, amongst the ruins, the ancient ruins of the site. And the basin for the collection of pine resin, reusing two of the walls of the perivolos of the actual temple. Their eviction from the site was a long and acrimonious compulsory expropriation process that lasted many years, and the wounds of which are still to heal. We had several discussions with surviving members of the family, including some peripatetic interviews on site. One of the things that impressed us was the emphasis they placed on the land itself, on the labor and the care that went into cultivating it, into planting the trees, especially the olive trees, which, as we know, they take years to come to fruition, and they are planted for the children and the grandchildren, not for the person who plants them. They are thus the lasting familial bond with the ancestral land. olive trees next to Estoa. And it is these olive trees that we encountered again during our archival work at the archives of the Euphoria of Antiquities. In this case, however, they were scripted in the bureaucratic language of administration. They had become a matter to be routinely processed. Year after year, after the expropriation process had been completed, the patriarch of the family, who was evicted, would apply to the archaeological service for the permission to harvest the olives and take care of the trees. The phrase "take care of the trees" from this Tadendra was cited in the actual application. Now, trees are now property of the Ministry of Culture, offering at the same time an amount of money to the ministry as a compensation for the right to harvest. The request was sometimes approved, at other times rejected, perhaps reflecting the tense moments in the relationship between the applicant and the archaeological service, because there were ongoing series of trials and a series of clashes, sometimes very, very tense. So perhaps that kind of acceptance or rejection of the application was also reflecting that specific moment in that long process of negotiation and tension. If we were to read only the archives and without doing any ethnography, we would not have been able to appreciate the importance of these olive trees that these olive trees held for the farmer and his family. In the same archives, we also encountered another separate request by another member of the broader family, the evicted family, to build a shed not far from the expropriated area, but still within the broader archaeological zone. A shed so that he can store and protect agricultural tools and implements. And interestingly enough, in that request, the applicant evokes the discourse of heritage. Some of these tools and implements, he would say, are heirlooms. They are invaluable for me. The plough, the sickles, the loom of my grandmother, which at your service, which deals with heritage and culture, should value and protect. I could have cited many other examples from these archives, but I hope that it becomes clear that the Euphoria archives, in this case, even when we're dealing with very recent and mundane affairs, constitute invaluable ethnographic sites, performative zones of contact between the state and local people, where diverse public rhetorical statements on material heritage have been deliberately deposited and scripted in the idiom of official discourse. This last case, and the rhetorical invocation of by the farmer of the recent material culture as valuable heritage that needs to be protected, raises the fundamental issue at the root of both the conventional archiving practices and the archaeological archive. What should be consigned to the archive? What should be left out? For example, as part of our archaeological ethnography at Polis, we collected several pieces of 19th and 20th century objects, material culture, traces of the recent life around the sanctuary, some of that which had to do with the family that was evicted and their daily lives, and some linked to the occasional visits by others to the site when the site was an open recreational space and before it became a fenced-off and thus official archaeological site. Now, do these objects constitute archaeological evidence? Can they be consigned to the archaeological archive, acquire the status of the archaeological evidence, deposited alongside our archaic classical and Hellenistic pottery to the museum, and be subjected to the same legal, museonomic, and epistemic procedures? According to current archaeological legislation, the answer is no. And we did not want to add to the already heavy and complicated procedural concerns of our colleagues by insisting that these objects should indeed go to the museum. But we found it productive within the context of our project to engage with our collaborators in a dialogue on the status of these material traces. And a dialogue did indeed take place, and I dare say sometimes a robust dialogue. Mary Douglas and her definition of rubbish as a matter out of place comes to mind. Because this indeed was a category, rubbish, that entered the debate more than once, at times as a joke, and other times as a serious description of these traces. Matter out of place that needed to be cleared away and disposed of before excavation started and before the serious archival procedures of archaeology got underway. Hence, a topology of privilege. To consign, to gather together in one place, to put side by side things that belong together is an authoritative archival principle, what Derrida calls the archontic principle. In other words, the very constitution of the archive, be it the conventional one or the archaeological, is a matter of aesthetic and political clashes. Aesthetic in the sense of sensible, as in what is deemed worthy to be seen, sensed, and experienced, and that classified as worthy to enter the archive. And political in the sense that there are clashes between different epistemic and invariable and inevitably social and broadly political perceptions. Before we even start working with the archives, thus, before we even begin our extractive and detective work, we'll have to be aware of these aesthetic and political practices and clashes that gave rise to them and led to their constitution. And to reinforce the same point, what are we to make of artifacts such as this, for example? An ancient block, part of a building of the sanctuary, but obviously much more than that. A block inscribed with a series of graffiti, mostly initials, dates, and ages. And you can see here, for example, the initials, and then an age, eton 14, 14 years old, and the year here, 1952. Now, we were able to locate some of the persons who inscribed this graffiti and talk to them about this object and connect a specific artifact to the ethnography. The initials refer to the children of the family that used to occupy the site until very recently. The block itself has been recorded by our team and is thus part of the archaeological archive already. But what about this graffiti on the top of it? Or the other graffiti scattered all over the site, again on ancient blocks. Or a statue base here, with some modern graffiti here, for example, and again initials of names. We made a point to record all these meticulously as part of our archaeological ethnography, and have used some of these spots as sets and stages for a series of ethnographic encounters with visitors, with tourists, with local people, and some of the family who used to live here. This block in particular functioned as a regular stop in the itinerary of tours we organized and conducted. It provided an opening into discussions on the workings of the archaeological surveys and the difficult issues of forced eviction and compulsory expropriation. The debates we had with countless visitors on this spot were at times unpredictable. Many Greek visitors, for example, felt that we were showing to them this block as an example of vandalism, as an example of someone having vandalized an archaeological object, as a case where an ancient stone had been destroyed due to the careless and ignorant actions of peasant children. These visitors were used to an archaeology operating primarily as the policeman of heritage, pointing the finger and denigrating people who do not appreciate the value of a glorious heritage. In another occasion, and while we were explaining to the group of visitors the deeply felt connections of this family with a specific plot of land, the co-director of the program intervened to say that they, the archaeologists themselves, had also developed an attachment to this site, working there for many years now, for more than a decade now. And of course, he had an extremely important point. More significantly, however, the staging of this social drama on this specific locale, with archaeologists, ethnographers, and visitors, was bringing into their surface hidden and unacknowledged associations, histories, feelings, but also contradictions and clashes. But this spot even became and proved even more inspiring for us. We're dealing here with an object which does not simply possess the agency to intervene in the debates of the present and the conflict between the archaeology and local contemporary life. It also invites us to rethink our archaeological ontologies and our long-established conceptions of materiality and temporality. How can we date this piece, for example? What is the date of this piece? Well, archaeologically, of course, we can say, for example, this is the 4th century BC. But does that dating not prioritize a specific point in this object's biography, its initial creation? This piece, this block, this stone, continued living. And in the 19th and 20th century, it was incorporated in the lives of the specific family who lived amongst the ruins. It was reworked, it was modified, acquiring new roles and new meanings. In our ethnography, also acquired an additional meaning. In that sense, its date is neither the 4th century BC nor the 19th century and the 20th century. This object is rather multi-temporal. It is a perfect example of the power of materiality deriving from its duration, but also its sensorial properties and qualities, to enable different times, to enable the activation of different times simultaneously, to be ancient and modern at the same time, and to undermine the linearity, the succession, which is at the center of many archaeological narratives. But at the same time, this object, the similar ones I have shown you, also teaches us that traces that constitute the archaeological archive of a site are not given and static, created only once by past people and then lying there waiting for us to record them and consign them to our archaeological corpus. They are rather dynamic and living, continuously in the process of becoming. If the recent inhabitants of this site have contributed to the traces that form the archaeological archive of this site, what about all the other traces that were accumulated during the process of archaeological ethnography? Inscriptions, for example, as for a primarily classical archaeological site are extremely important, as we know. And indeed, there was great excitement when a major inscription came to light in 2008. But what about other processes of inscription that were taking place there? From the visitor's book, we implemented, sorry, ignore this, the children's drawings that they were created during the visits to the site, or during the school programs we organized at the schools of Poros. Our ethnographic notes, the audio and the video recorded interviews on site, the extensive photographic renderings and depictions, which form part of a separate photoethnographic project that we actually implemented with the collaboration of Fotis Ifandidis, and examples of which you can see quickly here, and which are going to form part of a separate photo essay which are currently producing. Are these not part of the broader archaeological archive? And if so, how can we incorporate them? How can we make them a part of the permanent archaeological archive we are creating? And talk of photography brings me to the final point I want to make today. which relates more to the title of this lecture. If the principle of accumulation is an obvious one to invoke in relation to the archive, what about the principle of dispersal? Surely I don't mean the dissolution of the archives and the dispersal of their holdings. Let me begin with photography. In this archaeological ethnographic project, we placed immense significance to the photography as a process and to photographs as artifacts, not simply as documentary devices, but as creative ethnographic interventions. Photographing the excavation process, the visitors, the ethnographic informants, and all material traces on site and around it became a way to initiate dialogues and raise sensitive, often contentious issues on the ontology of our discipline, on boundaries, on ourselves and others. Photographs, even digital ones, become evocative mnemonic objects with immense agency. In addition to our photographic production, we also incorporated into our work more conventional archival photos, and we made them part of our archaeological and ethnographic work. In a sense, we made them part of an ethnographic installation, of a series of ethnographic installations. For example, we came across, and our colleagues showed us this photo, which is an 1894 picture photograph taken on site, the site of Calabria, by the first excavators of the site, the first Swedish team excavated on the site. When we came across this photo, we wanted to show it to the people we interviewed, especially the people who lived on site, the people who were the descendants of the people who lived on site in the 19th century. We somehow suggested to them hesitantly, especially to the farmer who is the person who was contesting the expropriation, who was clashing with the Archaeological Service, we suggested to him that the people portrayed here in this photo may be his ancestors. He was initially very dismissive of the idea. But a few days later, during a follow-up interview, he brought out the topic himself. He actually started talking about this picture himself. And this is an extract from that discussion we had. I wanted to ask you something, now that I remembered it. That photograph, have you got it with you? You know what I want? Because it sure must be my father, my grandfather. Afterwards I thought about it. But where did you find it? Who gave it to you? Well, it was in Sweden, in the archives of the first Swedish excavation in 1994. They were digging here, and this must be someone from your family, from your own family, since the land belonged to them. Yes, it must be my grandfather and my father. I'll bring you a copy for sure. Will you, my boy? So that I can have them with me. I'm interested in my father and my grandfather. I want to have them with me, since it happened to be found. I'm asking you this as a great favor. He then went on to say that he was going to enlarge it, he was going to frame it, and he's going to give it to his grandchildren as a present from the grandfathers. Whether they were indeed his family, although very likely, may never be proven for sure. But does it matter? Here is a photographic archaeological object, the power of which lies in evocation, memory and recollection, not representation, nor historical knowledge. An archaeological find of intimate biographical resonance. An offer from the archaeologist that this embittered and tormented person valued and treasured very much. Here, an archival piece moved out of the archive and even out of the scholarly and academic publications, and was inserted into the dialogues and debates within the shared space of archaeological ethnography. This is what I mean by dispersal of the archive. In some cases, this dispersal may lead to new knowledge and insights. At other times, it may deepen and strengthen an emotional bond between a researcher and his and her interlocutors. In any case, it can make the whole process of archiving more equitable and more democratic. It can undermine some of the archontic prerogatives at the core of the archival impulse. To be fair, some of the dispersal is already happening, especially through digital media. While there are still fiercely guarded bastions of exclusion, and we all know them, the privilege that rests on the exclusive access and on equally exclusive hermeneutic and interpretive work is today much more difficult to sustain and to exercise. But what I'm arguing is for a more conscious and deliberate, indeed well-planned dispersal of the archive as part of a broader archaeological or other project, or independently perhaps, as a series of site-specific, physical or digital exhibitions. A move which can expose and release the accumulated affective weight and trigger various scholarly and public, perhaps unpredictable reactions. As for the archaeological archive as a whole, this dispersal may take different forms, from the wide dissemination and circulation of the recorded information, as is being produced by archaeologists, making at the same time clear the conditions of the constitution and production of archaeological knowledge, to the dispersal of the archaeological objects beyond museums, in multiple spaces, and community-run collections within the arenas of daily life. To conclude, I hope to have shown that we archaeologists, even the ones not interested in the history of the discipline, will gain much by engaging with archives and with the archiving process as artifacts, conceptual categories, and scholarly and social practices. Both the conventional archiving and the archaeological one produce and sustain, in the sense of Michel Foucault, regimes of truth, that is, systems of order procedures for the production, regulation, distribution, and operation of statements. The acceptance and the consignment of a document in the archive and the classification of the material object or trace as archaeological produces a truth statement, well before any process of interpretation has started. I hope to have shown that this process of inscription and consignment is a highly contested one. Moreover, I have argued that the emerging field of archaeological ethnography is creating a space for these archival truth statements to be fully debated and contested in the public arena, involving many people and groups, not just the researchers. If the impulse to accumulate, which is at the center of the archiving process, produces certain, often exclusivist power effects, dispersal can enchain people in the sense of connection, enchain not in the sense of putting them into chains, enchain people, things, artifacts, objects, and documents in horizontal relationships of remembrance and can produce networks of affect. Thank you very much.